tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
There's a little bit of good news. It's kind of cloaked good news. You got to really search for the good news, because we know that the multi-billion-dollar deficits, which some reports have said could last us decades, are leading to a major debt crisis in Canada, which is causing there to be more money that we have to spend on interest payments, which is then causing more deficits. And it's very circular, but courtesy of our friends at the Fraser Institute, a case for spending restraint in Canada, how the federal government can balance the budget. The report they have published finds it can, in fact, be done. And if a government really wanted to, the budget could be balanced by 2026, 2027. Well, this sounded too good to be true, so I wanted to dig into it with Jake Fuss, who is the Director of Fiscal Studies at the Fraser Institute. Jake, always good to talk to you. Thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks very much for having me on.
Okay, so you're saying it could be done. You're not saying it will be done, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, we've seen a market deterioration in the state of federal finances since 2015, with substantial increases in spending and debt over that time. But what we do in our study is just look at a couple of different scenarios of how we could actually return back to a balanced budget, either by 2025 or 2026. 2026, I think, is a very realistic scenario that just offers a solution for government to really reduce the growth rate in spending over 2 years to 0.3%. It wouldn't actually require you to reduce spending from current 2024 levels. We could actually get back to a balanced budget by 2026 if the government just simply demonstrates some spending restraint.
Now, this is, I think, an important point, because there are ways you could balance a budget that would not be particularly healthy or sustainable. I mean, the government could raise taxes 500% and balance the budget, and it's balanced, but you haven't actually had a good fiscal portrait. What does your version look like? Is it just spending cuts? Is it revenue increases, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah, so really what we're looking at here is just pulling back on spending. So there's actually a lot of important research from some Harvard economists where they looked at past history of fiscal consolidation among OECD countries, and they found it was far more effective to either reduce spending or show spending restraint rather than raising taxes to actually balance budgets. It's better economically, and it was more successful fiscally as well. So there's a lot of research around this area. And what we're simply proposing is just a 0.3% increase in spending for over a 2-year period. So that isn't even asking necessarily for spending reductions from current levels. It's just peeling back on that spending that you have planned, projected for the next 2 years. That's really a realistic scenario for the government over a 2-year period.
So we've heard in the past, and I don't have the whole laundry list of them, but we've heard from the parliamentary budget officer some pretty grim projections. I mean, the one that really stood out a couple of years ago was that the budget wouldn't be balanced until 2070. Now, that's based on the track that the government had set out at the time. It stands to reason that the longer we stay on the current track, the longer it would take for this course correction you're describing, right?
Yeah, that's part of the issue too. Is it's not that we're in necessarily a crisis situation like we were in the mid 1990s yet, but if we keep going down this track of continually running deficits, continually accumulating debt, and with elevated interest rates now, that means you're borrowing more and more money. More of that money is going towards debt interest costs, which are already consuming a substantial amount of revenue, over 10% in the current year. So that problem really just gets worse over time the longer you put this off. I mean, the latest fiscal projections for the government show we're not going to balance the budget anytime before 2028 at the earliest. And that's only because their projections go out 5 years, and that's where they end. So, other reports from the PBO show it's going to be longer than that. So we really need to start talking about actual solutions here rather than just kicking the can down the road and hoping this goes away somehow.
I know there's often a difference between, politics and policy, and I think both sides tend to be annoyed with the other because they say that the other doesn't, understand how things are. I'm aware of the challenge that there isn't just a line item in the federal budget called waste that you can look at and say, all right, well, let's just cut waste. Waste is buried and embedded in a lot of different departments. So how easy would it be, or how difficult would it be to really go in and find ways that you could make some of these adjustments that you're talking about without taking a hatchet to entire programs or departments, which politically tend to be very difficult to justify doing?
Well, I think they should take the approach that the Chrétien government took in the 1990s. They really had a six-step process to evaluate programs and services on a case-by-case basis. So it was about, is this an appropriate role for government to be involved in? Are we running this program or service as efficiently as possible? So they had a whole set of criteria that they were looking at. And they're not just, chopping for the sake of chopping. They're actually evaluating these programs on whether or not they're actually effective and whether they're serving what the program actually is trying or intending to do. So I think that's a similar approach that the federal government could take now. But we know that, over the years, there's many examples of government fiscal waste. We had one report that looked at Auditor General reports between the 1980s and 2013, and it found that, mismanagement or waste of government was well over $100 billion during that time, according to those Auditor General reports. So we know that this is an area where the government can certainly make changes, is cutting back on that fiscal waste or removing it entirely.
Yeah, and what you're talking about here largely looks like a question of efficiency, not extraneous programs. You're not saying we need to cut this or cut that in a sense that would, it looks like, have a huge effect on service delivery, are you?
No, exactly. I mean, that's just the whole point here. It's actually about having effective spending too. There is a role for government, there is a role for programs and services ultimately, but the government also needs to have fiscal objectives. They need to have goals and anchors keeping them on a certain track as well. Right now we just kind of have policy that isn't even following the government's own self-imposed rules. They're not following their fiscal anchors, or the fiscal goals or fiscal rules, however you want to phrase it. And so we don't really have anything containing government finances right now. So we really need a plan moving forward about not only what we're spending the money on, but also taking that bigger picture look at government spending as well.
Who says fiscal policy can't be interesting as we head into our weekend here? Jake Fuss, Director of Fiscal Studies at the Fraser Institute. The study in question is called A Case for Spending Restraint in Canada, How the Federal Government Can Balance the Budget. So I think the real takeaway, it can be done. If you don't do it, it's just because you decided not to. So that would be the warning I'd put at the feet of any federal lawmakers here. Jake, always a pleasure. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks very much for having me on.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.